Alright, so ahead of yet another blockbuster match, it is time to re-up on the channel. Indian Wells so far this year, I think, to my eye, has been pretty good thus far. Young fellas have been holding it down, and I think the level throughout the course of the week has been pretty solid. And largely contributing to that has been the two men that will contest the aforementioned blockbuster match tomorrow, and that is Carlos Alcaraz and Jannik Sinner. This rivalry obviously in its infancy right now, but nonetheless it has given plenty of signs that, promise it being potentially one of the next great rivalries in the sport. And if the last match they played at the US Open is anything to go by, the first real classic that this rivalry produced, and boy was it a classic, we are in for a treat tomorrow. So we enter tomorrow's contest with the head-to-head locked at 2 apiece, and 3 meetings in 2022, all pretty compelling watches. Most recently, of course, the aforementioned US Open quarterfinal, the match that I consider to be the match of the year last year by far. And both players have looked to be in pretty good, in Alcaraz's case, I think, excellent form throughout the course of this tournament. Sinner took a bit longer to get going at the beginning of the tournament, but he too has rounded into form beautifully over the last couple of matches. And because of all this and what I've laid out already in this video so far, I think you can tell, I think tomorrow's going to be a battle between the two. And in spite of Carlos snapping his brief 2-match losing streak against Jannik last year with that US Open quarterfinal, if there's one thing that really has stuck out to me from this rivalry so far, is it just seems easier for Sinner to navigate it than it is for Alcaraz. And there really aren't that many players I think I can say that for in the case of Carlos, because, he's obviously separated himself among his generation, pretty much on a tier on his own as far as resume, and really just the complete package with all the variety he brings on top of his otherworldly athleticism, probably best forehand in the game right now, etc., etc. You've heard, all the praise I have for Alcaraz's game before. But despite that, when it has come to this matchup so far, in spite of the fact that I view Alcaraz having a bit more upside than Jannik, I think over the last year in those 3 meetings with Carlos, Jannik has done a really great job of taking advantage of those spots where I do think he has a bit of an edge. Obviously, he's become quite a bit more well-rounded under Darren Cahill. I think the serve improvement really at the forefront of that. And when compared to Carlos's, I think Jannik has the definite edge there as far as the serves are concerned. Within this matchup alone, you get the feeling still that Carlos hasn't really gotten a grasp or read on the Sinner serve as it has improved. There have been several points in pretty much all their matches where I felt like Carlos was getting the better of play once, the rally started, but so many times it's really not showed in the scoreboard. It has, historically been very hard for Alcaraz to really separate from Sinner. And obviously it's not for a lack of chances created, but against Jannik, obviously he went through that patch last year between those 2 matches with the final in Umag, I believe, and their Wimbledon round of 16, where he went, I think, a combined 0 for 16 or something like that on break point between those 2 matches. And having watched those matches, I put a lot more stock into that than, the same statistic, I believe. He was 0 for 16 before finally breaking Felix's serve in their 4 meetings, I believe. But in the case of that head-to-head, I didn't really take much stock into Felix's 3-0 lead. When you put context behind it, it was 18-year-old Alcaraz coming off of back-to-back 5-setters, and then kind of burnt out Alcaraz after winning the US Open last year in the 2 meetings on indoor hard courts. In the case of Sinner versus Alcaraz, I've seen it play out. You look at the sets that Alcaraz has won in this head-to-head, they, for the most part, have been super close. I'd only say there's really been one set in their head-to-head where, Alcaraz really put some distance between himself and Sinner on the scoreboard, and that was the first set of their US Open quarterfinal last year. And you could point out that this hasn't been for a lack of chances created. You look at every single match they've played, even the first they played in Bercy in 2021, which I feel is less relevant. But even there, Alcaraz came up with 11 chances, only converted 2 of them. 0 for 7 at Wimbledon, then 0 for 9 at Umag, and finally 11 out of 26 in that gargantuan US Open match. But for the lack of actual conversion, I think you can see where I'm coming from as far as I don't think Carlos necessarily has a great read on Jannik's serve yet. Now, it is worth noting that that wasn't necessarily the case in their US Open match. Alcaraz, did have chances to make that match easier on him than it ended up being, but that is not on account of return. Aside from a couple patches where, he was missing some routine returns that he should have at least put in play, for the most part, he returned center serve really well in that match, and, on a speedy US Open surface, there's a chance that maybe he did figure something out on that front. And obviously, with, all the chances that he's been able to create when returning the center serve, this is not to say that Alcaraz is completely clueless returning Jannik's. The numbers would not back that up at all. But what it comes down to is, on the flip side, Jannik Sinner has most definitely been more opportune when presented with chances, and as a result, he's been more decisive in sets, and you would have to say the matches they've played so far. And a reason for that, I think, is Sinner, it looks to me he does have a better read of Alcaraz's serve than the other way around. He seems to know very well how much Alcaraz favors that kick serve, both on first and especially second serves. And all of this, is to say that I think that as far as the serve return dynamic, which is always so important, I do think to this point Sinner has shown to have an edge there. He has seemed to have an easier time holding and returning serve than vice versa for the most part. And I think that's created a situation where it's kind of leveled the playing field, where Carlos, in spite of being further along in his progression, in my opinion, as well as being more well-rounded a player at this point in time, a lot of that stuff like the superior net play, touch, athleticism, finishing skill, etc., that seems like it kind of falls to the backdrop as, icing on the cake, and, as far as more core components that make up this cake per se, like baseline play, serve return dynamic, so ever important, they're a lot more level on those fronts. And obviously, this isn't to say that Sinner is one-dimensional. He's definitely upping his level in all different kinds of facets in his game. I can see it even within this year with how brilliantly he started. His net play seems even better than when it last left off at the end of last year. But just as far as, the baseline exchanges, Sinner hits as big a ball and as clean a ball as Alcaraz. He's a pretty sneaky good athlete himself. And from the back of the court, when Alcaraz hasn't been at his sharpest, he has even shown an ability to really make Carlos press. And while I don't think it's a huge edge on the serve return dynamic, I think Sinner still has the edge there. And, Alcaraz very well might have figured some things out in making life easier in this matchup. In my personal opinion, I do think that he has a bigger upside than Jannik, and I think eventually that's going to lead him to a place where he figures out a way to make this matchup more easy on himself than it has been so far. But as I was saying, even though Alcaraz won their last match, that was far from making things easy on himself, and, a lot of that was attrition on Carlos's part in being able to come through that one. So obviously, that leads us back to I think it's going to be a battle. Goes hand in hand with saying I think it's going to be 3 sets going the distance. But on the flip side, Alcaraz has looked really, really good this entire tournament. And it's not a case of him not being tested along the way. I think his second match, Talon Griekspoor, much improved over the last couple of years, but especially so this year. He played about as well as he could. Alcaraz came through that one in straights, and then especially last match against Felix. Albeit in pretty unfavorable conditions for Felix, I think FAA played about as well as he could on a slow court. I think his best showing of the season for sure. That was a match where I think that, the scoreline did not represent at all how, super quality a match it was. Both guys had some terrific shot making in there. And I say that Felix played so well, and in spite of that, he was on the ropes pretty much the whole way. He was clinging on to dear life to hold serve throughout that match. I think Carlos played his best match of the year there. There was the usual human highlight reel vast bag of tricks that Carlos has at his disposal on full display in his prior match, while of course being ruthlessly efficient, and I have touched on it in the past. I believe I made note of it ahead of the US Open in my preview for that tournament, but a lot of people are just jumping to the conclusion that Alcaraz's best surface is going to be clay, just based on the pedigree of Spaniards on that surface. The way that he plays is pretty much on the opposite end of the spectrum and so atypical of that Spaniard archetype that people just like to generalize to thrive on clay. Albeit, he's probably going to be a great clay courter as well. He's already shown to be very, very good on it. But I just get the hunch that hard courts are going to be his best surface. You can't tell for sure, but I think it's going to be hard courts. He just has looked more comfortable there when he's firing on all cylinders. I thought his level last year was at its highest during the spring, during the Sunshine Double, even higher than it was when he beat Nadal, Djokovic, Zverev back-to-back in Madrid. Regardless of whether he wins this tournament or not, I think he looked more at home throughout Indian Wells than he did romping to the title in Buenos Aires or at any point throughout Rio this year. And given, albeit a limited sample size because he's so early in his career, but given how well he played Sunshine Double last year, and given how well he has played this year en route to the semifinals, the conditions here really seem like a very nice fit to his game, and I would say they're more favorable to him than they would be to Jannik. And on that note, obviously, my thoughts are that I don't think I've seen enough to say that Alcaraz has put to bed a lot of the things that Sinner has done to make him uncomfortable in this rivalry. But given the marriage of form and conditions where I do think Alcaraz has an advantage, albeit as far as form is concerned, not a huge one, but I still think a significant enough one. And after all, pre-tournament, I did have a bet on Alcaraz to win the title. So he has been, who I've considered to be the favorite to take this title home from the jump, and so my pick is going to be Alcaraz in 3. I think he battles past Sinner for a second straight time, and I think he advances to the Indian Wells final. Regardless, though, tomorrow should be a good one. This is a blossoming rivalry with all sorts of promise. In 4 meetings to this point, we've already seen them play at 3 of the biggest tournaments in the world at either Masters or Slam level, and tomorrow they will be looking to make it 4 out of 5, and by the way, that one outlier also happened to be a final. So let's all sit back, enjoy the show, but that will do it for this video. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you enjoyed. If you did, it would be much appreciated if you could drop a like. Helps the video perform much better in YouTube's algorithm, and also subscribe to the channel if you're not already. Thank you all again so much for watching, and of course, I will see y'all in the next one.